The basic purpose of the Vietnam War was to stop the spread and to fight communism. The North and South sections of Vietnam were separated with communism in the North and democracy in the South. President Johnson made the difficult decision to send in troops in order to keep communism contained and attempt to unite the country under democracy. The Communist North, known as the Viet Minh, were led by the strong leader Ho Chi Minh. While attempting to contain the Viet Minh in the North, stabilizing the South was proving to be problematic. Rebel communist groups in the South, called the Viet Cong, were fighting American forces. At the beginning of the war, there was less opposition because there were less troops involved and therefore less law. The first protest march was in December of 1964. The installment of the draft created more protest and anger toward the war. This draft targeted the younger generation, and many students in middle-class families were able to defer by going to college, but those in lower classes could not avoid it and were more affected by the war. Minorities were impacted the most by the war. They were the ones getting drafted as they were not able to get deferments, and the expense of the war forced President Johnson to increase taxes and cut back on programs to deal with poverty. This caused minorities to suffer. The major movement of protests was led by the students, reasons being that they had good economic status, education, and a lot of people. They had many goals of social reform. When the war escalated, it became a major focus point. Things in the war escalated in a few ways. The use of chemical weapons was put in place and not approved of by the American public. More troops were sent over and even more people had died. And most people were foggy on the why we were fighting this war. People did not understand why America was fighting and therefore thought America should not. Even Vietnam veterans were protesting this war. They were disgusted with what they had done to innocent civilians and the death and chaos they had caused.
A song that appeared at the start of the Vietnam War and that represented the social unrest that was happening in the country was Masters of War by Bob Dylan. It came out in 1963 and talked a lot about the way the U.S. government was handling the war. The first stanza of the song discusses how the government is mass building weapons that are very dangerous, but the government themselves is protected because they just, as the song says, hide behind desks. The United States used Vietnam as a place to test out a lot of new weapons that they were developing. A lot of these were very dangerous. One example is napalm, which is an extremely flammable substance that they put in bombs and other weapons. Dow Chemical Company produced not only napalm, but also Agent Orange. As the Vietnam War continued, Dow became the sole provider of Agent Orange to the military, despite the numerous protests they faced. Another line in the song says, "You play with my world like it's your little toy." This is talking about how the United States is just going into Vietnam trying to control what is going on in that country, just like how we tried to control other countries' governments because we were scared of communism. This can also be interpreted from the perspective of young men being drafted because they feel like they are just being used like a child with their toy. They are easily replaceable and they feel like the government does not care about them. The line directly after that says, "You put a gun in my hand," which related directly to the idea of the draft because young men's options when they got called up was to follow orders and go fight in the military or go to jail. As the song continues, Bob Dylan sings, "A world war can be won, you want me to believe." This brings up the idea of the government's fantasy of what is going on in Vietnam. The commanders in Vietnam and the government kept saying that if they just sent over more soldiers, they would be able to win the war. When the U.S. first went into Vietnam, they thought it would be an easy war to win. Instead, they soon found that it was going to be a very tough war because of the guerrilla warfare that the Vietnamese used, how difficult and unknown to the U.S. soldiers the terrain was. Another part of the song says, "When the death count gets higher, you hide in your mansion, as young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud." This is a fairly direct attack on the government because it's protesting the fact that the body count in Vietnam is increasing extremely fast. But all the government is doing is sending more and more soldiers overseas. Another line that is very important is, "Fear to bring children into the world," which goes back to the idea of the draft because the protesters are saying they do not want to have children that are just going to have to send off to war when they are at a very young age. In the line, "You might say that I'm young, you might say I'm unlearned," Bob Dylan is responding to the criticism many people had about protesters. A lot of the older generation and government officials say the young people just did not understand what was going on in Vietnam and that they had not experienced or learned enough yet. The line, "All the money you made will never buy back your soul." Here, this is talking about how it does not matter how much money an official gets paid to do their job. By fighting a war like this in Vietnam, they are doing something irreversible. The The military-industrial complex is a phrase that describes the large growth of the military capabilities during the Cold War because the US felt it had to keep up with the Soviets. A lot of the weapons that were produced during this time were tried in Vietnam. The line of the song is talking about how all the money the industry made producing these weapons does not matter because in the end they caused a lot of people in Vietnam to be killed and injured. Bob Dylan's final remarks are, at the end of the song, "And I'll stand over your grave till I'm sure you're dead." Bob Dylan is talking directly to government officials when he says this. He is also saying that this is basically what they are doing when they send these kids off to war, setting them up to die. Overall, Bob Dylan's song addresses the fact that the government is making the wrong choices for the United States.
The song Ball of Confusion by The Temptations was released in 1971 and was mainly about wanting peace and also how the government ignored the cry of the people to stop the war. The title, Ball of Confusion, expresses some of the frustration because it talks about how the government was hiding the reality of the war, so no one really knew what was going on. They saw and heard different things from the media than what they were being told by the government. For example, the people were watching the war at home on their TVs and seeing how bad it was in Vietnam, but the government was telling them war is almost over and if we just send a few more men then we can win, and sometimes even North Vietnam is close to giving up. The song also touches on the effects of the soldiers. The line, "The sale of pills are at an all-time high," represents how the soldiers who came home started doing drugs. So the drug sale went up very high to a point that had never been reached before. When the Temptations sing "Vote for Me and I'll Set You Free," they're talking about how Nixon, who campaigned in 1968, was saying that he would end the war, yet the war is still going on. They also sing a line that says kids growing up too soon, meaning kids are having to go to war at a young age. The average age of the soldiers in the Vietnam War was 19 years old. The government was drafting boys in the war at 18 years old before they could even vote, which caused a lot of upset. They also touched upon how the government thinks money solves everything when they sing the line, "Politicians say more taxes will solve everything." When Johnson rose the taxes, he took away the funds for their welfare programs, which benefited the poor with housing and the essentials for life. In the line, "Fear in the air, tension everywhere," it's talking about the fear of communism that is everywhere we go, which is why the U.S. is fighting in Vietnam. They sum up the idea that the only thing we get out of the war is pain at home, with suicides, higher taxes to fund war, people protesting, and no support for the war because people want it to end. They repeat the line, and the band played on throughout the song as they mention worse and worse things that are going on. It represents how no matter how bad it gets at home or in Vietnam, the government does not care. No matter how many people die or people cry to stop the war, the government keeps putting troops and money into the war, saying it will be fine. Finally, they sing "Can't You Hear Me Talking?" They are speaking to the government directly because there have been protests, cries for help, and way too many deaths to just ignore them. They want the government to listen and hear them say when they say, "End the war."
In both the songs Ball of Confusion and Masters of War, there are many similarities and differences. These two anti-war songs were written 8 years apart and they show how the home front has changed throughout the war. Both songs talk about the age, but in different ways. In Ball of Confusion by Temptation, age is referenced when it talks about how kids are being drafted and killed too young. In Masters of War, age is referenced when Bob Dylan talks about how some people think that because the members of the protest movement are so young that they do not understand very much. But Bob Dylan is saying that they really do understand. Another similarity is how both songs talk about how the government is not doing anything while people are being killed in Vietnam. Each song says that the government is fantasizing about what they need to win the war, so they can win. In the Ball of Confusion, they just keep saying that if they have a little more money through raising taxes or send a few more soldiers, they will be able to win the war. Masters of War has a similar train of thought when it discusses how the government thought that Vietnam would be an easy war to win. That is what they want the American people to believe, when in reality it is very difficult. There are also many ways in which the two songs differ. In Masters of War, Bob Dylan is talking about how kids are just being handed guns and being drafted. He also talks about how the government is not really fighting, they are just giving soldiers these dangerous weapons to try out. It touches a lot on the fact that the government actions are really irreversible. On the other hand, in Ball of Confusion, Temptation talks a lot more about Johnson and Nixon's broken promises, such as the war on poverty. They also get a lot deeper into the effects of war and how it is hurting the soldiers in the long term. A big difference between the two songs was at the point where they were written during the war. Masters of War was written in 1963, while Ball of Confusion was written in 1971.
Music took the children of the era to a whole different level. The message was sent across America and worldwide. The social climate and the musicians became a collective conscience through lyrics and music, which became the foundation of ending the war. Music served as a rallying cry and cause for action and uniting factor of the people. The emotions that it brought out were strong and powerful, only adding to the movement. It counteracted the numbing effect that a war will bring to a country. The music targeted the youth through style and relatable lyrics. A very important thing since the war was being fought by the young, and the young at home were making the most difference. Music was a way for people to let out anger at the government in an intimate and personal way, but without consequence. It made people motivated instead of depressed, and most importantly, people felt hurt.